Kant for the thumbnail. I have to agree. See here. Play. Hopefully this is all good. Is this all good, everybody, on the stream? Are we lagging at all?
Not a huge issue, but I just can't see your camera. I don't know if that's just the way the stream works or what. But,
yeah, no. So for me to have my camera on Discord and on OBS at the same time, I'd have to like set it up differently, and I just haven't done that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, no, it looks like. Oops, sorry.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it looks like we should be good to go. If you want to, I suppose, introduce yourself for anybody who hasn't seen. I think we had a different debate before on free will.
Yeah, that was a couple years ago now, I think, actually. Yeah, so I guess just to introduce myself, you know, I call myself a philosopher in training. I'm working on my PhD, but you know, it's a whole process. My studies are primarily in Kant and philosophy of mind, along with AI. There's a whole discussion I could go into about why I see philosophy of AI as just an extension of the philosophy of mind, plus the philosophy of computation, but that's like a totally separate debate that we could maybe have someday. Yeah, so I am here because I'm also a libertarian anarcho-capitalist. And so we swing in the same circles a lot online. And the Kantian faction and the Randian faction like to butt heads, of course, as all libertarians do about all things. And so I'm here for us to have the debate, one could say.
Absolutely. So I suppose kind of what could be useful as like just a jumping off point is I suppose see if like because I've been accused, and obviously objectivists in general get accused of misrepresenting Kant. So I just want to sort of like walk through like what I see as like the position that Kant takes in like the history of philosophy, and then like I suppose we can see if I'm wrong on something, if you would interpret it differently. Does that work with you?
Yeah, I think there's actually going to be a lot of good stuff that comes out of this, so I'm totally happy to do that.
Sure. So yeah, no, basically the way I see Kant is he's an answer to Hume, because on Hume, obviously for people who aren't aware, you don't have any knowledge of anything really. The world is basically just fleeting, unnecessary, contingent sensations that don't have to go together. So, for instance, Larry Peikoff uses this example because these lectures were he did his lectures on this a while ago of smoking a cigarette, right? Where there is nothing inherently that would force the smoke to be staying with the cigarette, or the white dot on the end, or the heat. The heat could be across the room. All the different things that make up the cigarette, as far as sensing it is concerned, there's nothing that forces them together on Hume. They just happen to have gone together so far. And then basically what Kant is trying to do, as far as I see it, is give an answer to this, to get something, some sort of necessary synthesis. That's his word for facts about reality, is synthetic facts. So he wants to show like, okay, why is it necessary that the heat of the cigarette, the white bit on the end, why is it necessary that all goes together? And his answer to this is basically by coming up with various categories in the mind that allegedly allow us to have an orderly world, which is just kind of in your mind, the phenomenal world, he calls it. Would you say that's an accurate assessment thus far?
Yeah, so I'd say that's like one fork of it is definitely so. In the beginning of the first critique in the preface, Kant, you know, famously, very famously, and without a shred of what's the word I'm looking for, bashfulness, I guess, whatsoever, calls his philosophy the Copernican revolution in philosophy. and what he's distinguishing himself as, I think you do a pretty good job of distinguishing him from the skeptical empiricist, but he's also trying to distinguish himself from the dogmatic rationalist. And this was the tradition that Kant like grew up in, the Wolff Leibniz tradition that was like really dominant in continental Europe, especially at the time of his philosophical upbringing. And he did a lot of writing, decades of writing and research and teaching on that before he took his silent decade, as some people call it, between his last publication as a rationalist Leibnizian into the critical philosophy. So I think you definitely captured the skeptical empiricist angle. I think those are all valid concerns that Kant wants to address to distinguish people or to diffuse people like Hume. So yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, my issue with how specifically he goes about this is that it seems to me that this is kind of divorcing us from reality if we accept this to be true, that everything we experience is in fact there's no better word for it than an illusion. It's not corresponding to things as they really are, or it might correspond to things as they really are, but we have no way of knowing if it's corresponding to things as they really are. So this is sort of an epistemology of a fantasy world. Would that be accurate?
No, and but I'm curious. I want to ask you why you think that that's the result of what Kant's proposal is.
Sure, because I mean, if things as they, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but is his claim not that it because you have certain means of perceiving, that those means are going to impart upon whatever it is that comes from things as they really are, and so that's not seeing it as it really is, sort of like a two tables type of thing, where, oh, well, you're seeing the table as like brown, as you feel it and it's smooth, but it's not really in reality that that only corresponds to your means of perceiving the table. It doesn't correspond to the table as it actually is.
Yeah, so I think so. What I want to say here is that I think that what you're pulling on is like a tension that a lot of people pulled on, especially like in the early days of the critical era. And then some like, and there's an entire strand of Kantian philosophy, especially immediately after the publication of the critique, that you see from people like Jacobi, who have this exact worry, who are like, whoa, Kant, the theory that you're giving me is basically, for all intents and purposes, it is that reality as it is completely unknowable to me and is what the real world is. And everything that I have, all the objects that I'm aware of, all empirical objects, are just mere illusions. They're just things that I concocted in my mind. And I think Kant wants to make a meaningful distinction here in asking, what do you mean when you say reality out there as it actually is? What are we trying to indicate whenever we point outside of our cognition and say, well, what is the object actually like? What is loaded in the actually? And his basic line is going to be that, look, what I've given you, and we can go through some of these things in more depth later if we need to, but like, what I've given you is I've given you the necessary structure in order for anything to count as an object at all for us. And to ask, okay, but what is the object actually like apart from that system is a question that we can't answer. It's not just, it's like an incoherent question to be asking. And I think you actually see a pretty decent amount of this same kind of thing in Rand, for what it's worth. I think it's like chapter 4 in the ITOE, where she's talking about how, actually, Peikoff is the better case here, but I can't remember which chapter this was from, but Peikoff is talking about how the distinction between the metaphysical and the epistemological isn't in his view, it isn't a philosophical distinction. And what I take him to be getting at when he's saying that is that we're leaving the domain of philosophical truth seeking whenever we try to ask what things are actually like apart from our capacity to represent them as objects. And that, I think, is the exact distinction that Kant is trying to draw. Kant is just saying that we cannot have objective knowledge of things as they are apart from how we cognize them.
Sure, but then, like, I think he's taking it in a bit of a different direction, to what someone like Peikoff might take it. I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to there. Maybe I need to read more Peikoff. But it would seem to me that the objectivist approach would be, well, the object is what it is, independent of you, and your means of perceiving it are valid because, well, that is some interaction between your sensory organs and that object. So it is telling you facts about that object, that it's bright, that it's smooth, and now you can investigate what those sensations actually like existentially, what causes them. If you engage in some science, it's like, oh, it's bright, and because it's got electrons moving through this wire in it, and those electrons end up heating up the metal enough to where it gives off all this radiation, which we can see. Now you could do that, but it seems to me that, well, on Kant's view, would you ever be able to? You wouldn't be truly be able to dig down to what it actually is. That, well, the object itself, what it means for it to be an object, as you were putting it. Well, that actually is purely based upon, what's happening in here rather than what's happening out there. So, in what way isn't that giving us like a fantasy object instead of the literal object itself? Like, how would you? I mean, can you study what the object actually is? It seems like you can, and if you can't, well then, how are we not in a fantasy world?
Well, let me ask you this. So I don't want to sound like I'm dodging your question, but I want to try to understand like where the actual disagreement is. Because if we go through like chapter 4 of the ITOE for real this time, that's where Rand is articulating her theory of perception. Like she begins at the level of sensation, but she immediately wants to separate herself from the sense data theorists like Russell, who were fairly popular at the time. And she kind of like follows in the same tradition as like Beatrice Edgell, honestly, who is more of like her contemporary than someone like Sellers would be. In that like, hey, sense data alone isn't going to be able to get us, just pure sensation isn't going to be able to get us objecthood. And so she constructs what I think very reasonably is the notion of the percept. But the percept is not just sensation. It's not just the causal interaction of a wire heating up with our eyes. She offloads a lot of the work there to what she calls neurological processes or automatic integration. And so there's a certain sense to which this like automatic process of integration is occurring before we even have a percept that counts as an object for us to begin doing any of the substantive like abstractive work for attribution of properties or attributes, as she calls them. Yeah. For the attribute, for the grant, I don't know what the proper terming would be there. I keep wanting to say the attribution of attributes, but the elucidation, I guess, of attributes of entities would be at the post-neurological integration level. And what I want to say is that, like, well, that sounds a lot like what the kind of theory that Kant is giving, except for Kant is just filling in what's going on at that neurological level. And so we have like on both theories, from where it seems to me, it seems like we have the exact same level of access to the object as it is in and of itself. And that's none, because we never get the object as it is in and of itself. We only either get a percept or a representation or however we want to cash this out. And so I'm just trying to figure out like where in the objectivist picture does it, like anything that we've gone through with Kant so far, make it such that because cognition has a kind of form and that form is an active process, that we no longer have any claim to reality or objectivity or anything like that?
Sure. So I'll use the analogy that Peikoff makes to sort of the way that a religious person might go about this. It's like, well, what why is there a universe? What makes the universe lawful? And it's like, well, there has to be something to make it lawful. And that something is called God. And now, why is God lawful? Well, we gotta have some starting point, guys. Come on, we can't just go back in an infinite regress. And we're just saying that the starting point is God. It's like, well, that's kind of completely arbitrary. Why are we digging down beyond what we can observe, namely that the universe is lawful? Why aren't we starting there as far as philosophy is concerned? Now, you can investigate why it's lawful, and that would be some particular science. What causes the planets to orbit and so on and so forth. You can investigate that, but that's outside of the realm of philosophy. As for philosophers, pardon me, we just have to start with something. And the thing we're supposed to start with is the thing that we actually do directly observe. Now, on the epistemology side, what do we definitely observe? And everybody would agree that we observe this, is that humans can integrate sensory data into percepts. That is true, right? So what Rand is saying is, well, let's start there. We have to take some things as given, some cognitive capacities as given for humans, and, well, let's take as given the things that we can directly observe. And now, perception scientists could go and investigate why and what specific mechanisms are involved in seeing and hearing and so on. But that's outside the realm of philosophy. Now, Kant is kind of rationalistically, he is trying to deduce out what the particular means of perception indeed are. He's not just taking it as given that man can integrate these things automatically. He's going, how is he able to do that? And he's and that's where his categories come in, right? Now this strikes me as entirely arbitrary in the same way, because even then he still is taking certain things as given. That man has the capacity of memory, that he has the capacity for synthesis, that he has various a priori concepts, and so Kant is still taking some things as given. He's just kind of arbitrarily going that step deeper, like the religious person would for the question of why is the universe lawful.
I think so I want to grant Kant himself, again in the preface, is hey, I am totally taking for granted the fact that there is some empirical experience. This thing, when you're holding my book in your hand and you're reading it, that's real. We have to figure out how to explain that. And so that's the given for Kant, is just nothing I say can ever contravene the fact that what is occurring to you right now is actually happening. And so I think the problem is that with the indication of, or the accusation of arbitrariness. I think that the idea is that we have Kant is just going arbitrarily one step too further, because all we need really is to say that well, there are these processes, that perception is valid, and then we get everything we need from that. And I think what this is missing is it's missing the key notion in epistemology, since Plato, basically. And we can complicate this a little bit with Gettier if we want to. We could get into some of that. But knowledge is true justified belief, maybe with a little star next to it. I'm not super compelled by Gettier, but I know a lot of people are, and I don't want them to feel like I'm just blowing them off. But true justified belief. And justification has always been the component that has been the most difficult for epistemology since people have started doing epistemology. Getting the true stuff, that's either going to be some kind of correspondence theory or whatever. You can come up with other theories. People have lots of very interesting ideas about that. But justification has been the battleground. Justification is part of the reason why sense data theorists never took off, because they could get belief, they could get truth through sense data theorists, or through their sense data theories, but they could never fully convince people that you could get justification just through immediate acquaintance with sense data. And what Kant is trying to do here is he's trying to get to the root of justification. And I think the problem with saying, well, percepts are necessary, I think, yeah, sure, percepts are necessary. We could just take that on. Maybe we could quibble just a little bit about what's in the percept, what isn't in the percept, what constitutes the entity. We could debate about that. But the idea that percepts are this fundamental thing, sure. They're necessary, and they're the lowest level that we have the capacity to cognitively engage with. Totally fine with that. I think what Kant is asking is, not why is it necessary, not why is it must be the case, but why is that the ground for justification as such? Not is it the ground for justification as such, but why is it the ground of justification? And it seems like you have two options, and you have one is that you have one option that says that, well, actually there is no justification there, But that seems like we have a problem for epistemology then, because we're no longer dealing with the normative element that's supposed to be a key component of knowledge. But if you go the other way and you say, well, there is justification there, you have to figure out what about the percept, what about the automatic integration, the active process gives us the normative element. And Kant's, I think there's a very strong case to make that Kant's system fits inside of that. And he's like, hey, this is how we get the object. This is how we get sense into object. And that's where the justification component for knowledge comes in. That's what lets you abstract out from these objects or entities into a full system of knowledge.
So, let's say that this is the case, that this is like a real problem that we've got to ground. Like, okay, well, how do you justify that? How do you justify that it'll keep being the case, so on and so forth? Let's take that as given here. It seems to me that Kant's answer is really no answer at all. Because eventually, if you keep going down what Kant is saying, well, he's gesturing at what? Our noumenal minds in some noumenal world, which we don't know anything about. And it's this unknowable thing, which is, keeping this all in order and so on. Now, I would submit that gesturing at something unknowable, in fact, doesn't solve the problem at hand. It doesn't answer the problem at hand, because you're just saying, well, in effect, why are we able to perceive things? Why will this be a necessary synthesis? So on and so forth. Well, something unknowable happens, and happens is not even the right word. You can't say anything about this noumenal world, of course, which, I wonder how the hell he's able to talk so much about it if he doesn't know anything about it. But it's, in effect, he's saying, well, something unknowable happens, and that's why we're able to perceive guys. Now, he says it in quite a lot more words than that, but is that not the essence of the Kantian approach here?
I think it might just be useful. I pulled it up because I knew this was going to come up. But it's B307 in the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant first lays out the phenomenal noumenal distinction. And what he says, this is I could read it if we wanted to. It's a paragraph, but I could just translate it as, there are two conceptions of the noumenal. One is the noumenal in the negative sense, which is the object as it is apart from our sensible intuition. That is the negative sense of the noumenal. And the thought of the idea as it is apart from our sensible intuition, because under Kant's system, it can't be an object for us if it's apart from our sensible intuition. So to say that like there is an object is itself undermining, or not undermining, but it just doesn't make any, there's nothing for us to cognize at all once we remove it from sensible intuition. And sensible intuition is just, you can think of it as just like the foundational rules for the immediate synthesis of objects. So space, time, stuff like this, as forms. And the positive conception is, he goes, well, okay, what if it was the object as cognized by something other than a sensible intuition, a finite sensible intuition? And Kant's like, well, I have no fucking idea what like an infinite intellect would cognize like, because I don't cognize like that. Because what it is for an object to be an object is to be a product of finite sensible intuition for me. And so in both of these cases, what he's doing is he isn't actually saying, and so the cause of this whole system, the thing, the thing, if you could just reach far enough and grab it in the background, is this noumenal thing, this noumenal fabric behind all of reality. He's talking about the idea that insofar as an object is an object of sensible intuition, we must necessarily be able to think about the object as apart from that. But that thought doesn't have any objective content. That's the whole point of the noumenal distinction in Kant. It can't have any objective content for us.
Well, it strikes me as still being the case that, well, he is indeed gesturing at this unknowable thing for keeping all this in order, right? Because why are the categories staying in order, what prevents them from like breaking down tomorrow or what have you. Well, it's gesturing at things as they really are, and as you're saying, you actually have no access to things as they really are, which, that's a redundancy. There is no reality as it really isn't. There's only reality. So, because your consciousness isn't infinite, because it is what it is, that means that you have no access to reality, which means you're not conscious, right? So, what are you if not conscious? Well, I suppose dreaming. I don't know how you'd be able to dream without ever being conscious, but it seems to me that that's what's going on here.
I think the thing to keep in mind here is, again, it's not, whenever Kant talks about noumenal, and I will go ahead and concede that there are parts of this book where Kant gets sloppy. There's parts of, especially, like, I think in the second critique is where he gets the worst about it. There's a couple parts of the second critique where I'm like, why did you say it that way? But if we just break down exactly what Kant is trying to get at whenever he's making the phenomenal noumenal distinction, if you conceive of the noumenal as reality as it actually is, then Kant's entire project is fundamentally incoherent in a way that it doesn't have to be so. There's no reason that you have to conceive of Kant's project that way. It's easy. It's a bit like when people say that, like, Rand is a naive realist or something like that. That's a really easy way to blow off Rand, but that's like not what she's actually getting at. She wants to have objective knowledge of objects as they are in the world without being a naive realist. Kant wants to have objective knowledge of objects as they really are without being like a pure Berkeleyan idealist. And the point that I really wanted to make sure I pushed on is this idea that, oh, well, you have to have this notion of the noumenal in order to make, the categories always work or something like that. And this is like a modal claim, actually. Kant does say that they're necessary. They necessarily always occur. But they're norm-governed faculties. These are functional descriptions of norm-governed faculties. We don't literally expect to cut open people's brains and find, like, oh, look, there's necessity and there's causality and all of that stuff. They're functional descriptions in the sense that these faculties are designed to work this way, and they just do work. They work very well. They're reliable. And but that's not because there is some noumenal object behind everything that makes it so. That's just part of what it is for to be the kinds of things that they are, is that they are reliable.
Well, so I suppose maybe I'm just confused about what I was going to say what the noumenal is, but I'm not sure you can even say that the word is there. Like if the noumenal world doesn't refer to reality as it really is, and everybody who thinks that is misinterpreting Kant, like what is the noumenal world? Does even apply to noumenal if existence is one of the categories?
Sorry, I had it on this other page here. Yeah. It is the thought of a thing insofar as it is not an object of our sensible intuition. So Kant does not want to be saying that. Sorry, I had to make sure I was reading that correctly from my copy. Kant does not want to be seen as saying that, like, there is actually some object that must necessarily be so. Now he talks about, I'm immediately going to complicate this because I don't want it to feel like I'm like pulling the wool over your head or something like that. He complicates this when he talks about affectation, right? When he talks about how sensation at all is possible. And he talks about, yeah, well, look, we're finite sensible beings. There has to be something that's affecting us because of that. And so we have this notion of affectation. And he goes like, yeah, maybe it's that noumenal thing. Maybe that's what's doing the affectation. But never is, it's always just it's like a postulate. It's like a thing we have to be able to think. It's not that there is literally a noumenal object somewhere. There cannot literally be a noumenal realm somewhere, because for something to be any sort of way, anywhere, is already for it to be cognizable as an object of a sensible intuition for us. And so that is, I think, the thing that I really want to sell. And do you remember in the ITOE when Rand is the workshops where people keep bringing up, the various professors and whatnot. They keep bringing up like, well, how does this apply metaphysically? And Rand always, I think it's very good that she does this. She's like, what do you mean metaphysically? Like as distinct from epistemology, or like what are we doing here? And what she's trying to get at in this case is that like if what you want Kant to be talking about is the thing as it is apart from any of our capacities of knowing what a thing is whatsoever, he's not going to be able to give you a story about that. And Rand isn't either. They're both like in this position that like the question of the thing that is apart from all of our possible faculties of knowing, it cannot be an object of knowledge for us, and there's nothing to say about it.
So if some noumenal object is a thought about a thing as it is apart from our sensible intuition, I believe is your term for it. Well, are you indeed thinking of something, right? Or are you just thinking? Is it thought thinking of itself?
It's not a thought thinking of itself. It's the idea of a category of things, and we can do this. I can think of I can think in my head of like, God, what would like a 7-dimensional thing that's all worm and all spaghetti monster that like doesn't interact with time at all but can still do things, what would that be like? I can form that in my head. I can string all of those concepts together and I can make them look like a question that should have some kind of an answer to it, right? Or at least like a definitive answer one way or another, right? And the point is to say that just because you can string those things together in your head doesn't mean that there's anything that it corresponds to. This is like a product of what it is or how we think is that we can do this stringing together. And as soon as we, like I said earlier, as soon as we have the idea that like, oh, we have a form of perception, as soon as we know that we have a form of perception that allows us to have objective knowledge of objects, objective knowledge of entities, we could say, then as soon as we could say that, we could say, well, what if we just pluck that out? What if we just pluck that condition out? What is that thing like apart from the thing that makes it so? And Kant says, there's nothing to say there. And I think Rand also would say, there's nothing to say there. There's nothing that it is like for us to think about an object as it is apart from the form of perception.
Right, indeed. You can't perceive apart from your perception. But at least Rand would say, well, there is actually a thing there. Like the thing literally does exist, whether you're perceiving it or not. But it seems to me that on the Kantian view, we've got, like turtles all the way down. It's thought all the way down. Because, well, the phenomenal is surely a realm of thought. Like, can't imagine that the phenomenal would be the realm of reality as it actually is. Well, now also the noumenal is in fact thoughts themselves as well. So the noumenal is also thoughts about whatever it would be. Because it can't even be a thought about a thing, because thing applies only to the phenomenal. If it is thought all the way down, well then in what way aren't we in this world of illusion? In which way is it not the case that everything is just thought thinking of itself?
I guess I want to bring back again. Don't want to feel like dodging, just trying to dig down here, because I feel like I could just like repeat some stuff I've said before. But maybe it would be just good to loop back just a little bit and be like, hey, so like we've already agreed that Rand has this notion of percept that is distinct from mere sensation, that is an active process, and I just want to ask, what fundamentally, what is the real distinction? If Kant had just, instead of doing the whole first third of the critique and was just like, hey, I'm just going to do my theory of empirical concepts, right? And what I'm going to say is that everything that comes before that gets us to the level of the percept that we can then abstract empirical concepts out of is like all of this neurological stuff in science will solve that one day. But he did all of the rest the same. Would any of his conclusions be like necessarily like, oh, this is thought all the way down? Oh, this is going to be like a massive problem? Because it seems like we're in the same fundamental decision point where the percept is not the object in the world. Rand is very clear about this. She's not a naive realist. It's not a window to the external world where you just like look out of your head and you just see the object as it is. The percept is an integration of sensations. It is made into an entity for us. And that's consciousness's awareness of existence. The form by which it's aware of existence would be the better way of putting that. And so I just feel like I could go through this series of answering that question again, but like, how could I not just reflect that same criticism back onto Rand? The fundamental thing that we are aware of is not of the world, it is of us.
Well, so the percept on Rand's view would be an integration of the sensory data, which is directly referring to the things out there, right? Now, I would have thought previously on Kant's philosophy that, well, the way he's grounding it is he's grounding it in these noumenal things. So I wouldn't have said initially that it's all thought thinking of itself. But then you were saying that the noumenal actually means thoughts of things apart from our perception of them. So, but then it seems to me that, well, this is terminating in thought. Like, so I don't know where, because Rand, it would terminate in reality. It's, well, this is a thought about reality. It's perception of reality. And I can grasp that. But I can't grasp where do we get the of reality in Kant.
So I guess instead of asking this time, I'll just say at least how I read it, and maybe we can just disagree about Rand interpretation or something. There's no point. Rand never makes claim to us having awareness of sensation. And I think this is really important because we don't have awareness of sensation. We have awareness of percepts. We have access to percepts. It's the fundamental epistemological unit. And so how do we get to the notion of sensation at all? And she goes, well, we're finite cognizers. We don't have the ability to just manufacture anything that we want in our experience of the empirical world. And so there must be some sort of sensibility. This is the term Kant uses, sensibility, that is at least partially responsible for the production of these percepts that gives it what we could call its matter. And the form of cognition is what converts the matter of sensibility into an actual object. And I think from this perspective, when we say, oh, well, Rand can just make an appeal to, well, the senses or the sense data that's coming off of the thing is coming off of a real thing. And the question is epistemologically, how? Because you don't have access to that thing. And I think Rand's best move, and I think the one that she tries to make, and the one I think Peikoff makes in Opar, that I read and was like, wow, I should have read this stuff again a lot earlier, is that we're stepping outside of the bounds of what it is for a thing to be an object for us whenever we start asking questions of how the thing ought to be, apart from how we cognize of it or how we perceive it or whatever terminology that we want to use in order to talk about how an object is an object for us.
Well, so I'm not sure what the upshot of that is, because, well, for Rand, yes, indeed, epistemologically, the terminating point is perception, but a perception is a perception of something. It's an awareness of something, and like that, I get that. That's how we that's the ground level when we get into the metaphysics and so on. But like, can't have it that, well, a perception is a perception of something, because what does that mean? Something, right? Some existing thing which he has only in the mind, right? A percept for Rand isn't this purely mental construct which has no relation to anything. It is a perception of something. It is an integration of sensory data. That's what it is. So, like, I don't see how. I mean, is Kant doing the same thing? Is for Kant, you are indeed perceiving something out there?
No, well, yes. Well, first off, what I want to say is that like constant empirical realists, I want to make sure that that claim's out there. You can think that that's like incoherent or whatever, but he thinks that when I see this Dr. Pepper can that I've been sipping on this whole time, he's like, no, there's like an actual Dr. Pepper can out there, and like you are actually seeing the Dr. Pepper can. It's a real Dr. Pepper can. It exists apart from you. That's Kant's claim. Maybe we think that's incoherent, right? I just wanted to get that out there. Uh, I kind of want to talk about like this may feel like a slight bit of a pivot, but I think it's actually really good. Again, something I liked a lot when I was reading Peikoff in OPAR. The objectivist color theory, right? I think Peikoff when he makes this, people want to for a long time, basically. I mean, pre-Locke, even like medieval era, pre-modern. People are talking about color and they're like, oh man, this color thing, it seems to be different than like extension and mass and all these other features of objects. So like, let's just call color this like secondary thing and maybe it's not even real, right? Maybe we don't have to worry about it. And Peikoff is like, whoa, guys, what are we doing? Why are we saying that color isn't real just because we perceive color? And so if there's like my Toyota Corolla is red, when I say that my Toyota Corolla is red, I am not committing myself to the fact that there is redness apart from me in the world. I don't have to make any reference to the idea that there's redness apart from, I don't have to make any reference to the fact that there is redness, something that is attributable as redness and is distinct from redness, but nonetheless results in my perception of redness because the object is red. All that I'm saying is that because of my perception has a kind of form to it, that when I see a red Toyota Corolla or Camry, then I am seeing the object as it actually is under that form of perception in the only way that I could ever possibly think of as it actually is, which is under that form. So if we were to say that like, no, redness is actually like the waves coming off of the photons getting reflected off of the paint of the car, and those come from the sun, and we can do all of this wave math. There's no amount of math that you're going to be able to do in that situation to get color out of it. It never becomes color just by explaining the physical processes underneath it. You have to have a kind of structure. You have to have a set, what I want to call rules, for how we integrate sensation in order to make that into a color like red. And this doesn't make color subjective. This is the part that I loved so much. Peikoff repeatedly says, this does not make color like subjective or ephemeral or not real. Red is real. It is a real part of how, or black. Black is real. This book is black. I can say that authoritatively. It is objectively true that that book is black because perception has a form to it. And I just want to say, like, this, I think, is this distinction between something being subjectively attributable at the level of the conditions under which it is possible, and yet objective because those conditions are objectively so. That is like a super Kantian insight. And it blew my socks off whenever I was reading this stuff about it, because I was like, I didn't expect this. I wanted to hear something about how actually red is just like this thing that's made up in our heads and it's actually just waves of light. And thank you, science, for explaining that to us. No, red is objective. That's great. That's the Kantian insight there.
Well, so I think it's being done in a completely different way to the Kantians, though. To the Kantian, it seems to be like, well, objective. That would be the collectively intersubjective or what have you. Intersubjective, right? That's, I mean, because even when you were saying there that, well, there is an actual Dr. Pepper can out there. It does indeed exist apart from you, but existence, that is one of the categories. So when you're saying that, you're not saying it in the same way that an objectivist would say it, where, yeah, the car is objectively red. That means that objectively the entity called the car is constituted such that when I interact with it using my eyes, I get the sensation of red. That is objectively the case, right? But that's some relationship between your eyes and some actual existential object. And of course, Rand would never say, well, existence, that just means in your brain. But, Kant does say that existence means in your brain.
I don't think it's, I think this is the best part to come in here, is that you need to I think the better way to think about the categories isn't like, oh, existence is this thing in my brain, insofar as it is a lot, it works a hell of a lot like color does in the objectivist theory. And that's that we're given this Kant calls it the manifold of sensory intuition. The manifold of sensory intuition comes to the understanding, which is the faculty of the categories, and it needs to be synthesized under the rules of the understanding, the categories again. And so what's happening isn't it's not really fair to Kant to say like what's happening is like I'm injecting existence into this like morass. It's a structuring principle. It's taking, again, this distinction between matter and form. If I had thought ahead enough, I would have had my correspondences book with me of his letters, because there's this letter that he writes in 1785, I think, that I love, because he makes the distinction super clear between his philosophy is not trying to, the transcendental idealist philosophy is not trying to dictate that the matter, what he calls it, of cognition, is the thing that's governed. The matter of cognition is given. The form of cognition is the thing that transcendental idealism is supposed to be elucidating. And the form of the cognition is of existing objects. And this is just where I want to come in again and just say that really quick, like that gap between we get sensation, there are some neurological processes, we have entities. Kant just wants to say that however we go from sensations that are not objects to objects has to have some kind of existential quality to it. There has to be some kind of rule, some kind of process going on that makes this morass of sensations into a coherent entity for me.
Well, so indeed, on the Kantian view, that would be my understanding, that existence is kind of, I suppose, tagged on. Something in your brain is kind of just in that morass, as you describe it. Something just kind of plants an existence flag in there, and then something else is planting like a quantity flag, and so on and so forth. But that is like completely at odds with the objectivist viewpoint. It's not that we start with their sensations here, and then at the end we end up with an entity. It's that there was already the entity in reality, and the sensation is sensation of that entity in reality. And so you're not having to bring in these flags and plant them into different matter. You're not having to do that on the objectivist viewpoint. It was already an entity, and you are able to perceive that entity through various neurological mechanisms.
The question is what licenses you to that? Because the fundamental epistemological unit, again, is the percept. It's not the sensation. We don't even have epistemological access to the sensation as sensation. We only have it as the uptake of automatic integration. And so if we only have it as the percept as the uptake of automatic integration, then what even licenses us to say that like, oh, I see how we got from this sensation-y stuff to this thing. And like, I know sensations have to be caused by something outside of me because I'm a finite sensible being. And since they like look similar enough, or however, I don't even know how we would go about evaluating raw sensation against the object, because the only thing that it is to be anything for us is for it to be an object. At least empirically, we could put it that way, couch that a little bit. But to then make the inference, I suppose, that like, well, the sensation just must be of that object as it is. And that seems to fly into the face of Rand's own protestations of the sense data theorist. Why not just be a sense data theorist at that point? Why not just say, yeah, we get the sensory uptake. The sensory uptake is of the object as an entity in the world. And then we just, we do some abstraction and we like match the colors and we draw some lines in our head. And then it's like, boom, cool. We don't need this we don't need this theory of percepts to build off of if we can make meaningful, true philosophical reference to the object as it is apart from sensation through just sensation.
So, I'm not familiar with Rand's, familiar enough, I'll say, with Rand's issues with sense data theorizing. But what we do just directly observe, if we're going to be scientists of perception, the starting point is indeed the case that humans do get these integrated percepts. Now, How specifically that happens, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist. But that it, the fundamental point on the objectivist view is that, well, what does that actually refer to? It is consciousness of something out there. It's not that the very concept of thingness is imparted by our brain out onto reality, which seems to me that's the entire, at least one aspect of the Copernican inversion that Kant's engaged in. But then, like, consciousness is consciousness of reality, right? That's the primacy of existence viewpoint. That consciousness is kind of metaphysically passive in that way. I'm not sure if passive would be the correct word to use there, but I think you get what I'm meaning. Whereas it seems to me that, well, the Kantian viewpoint would have it that it's a lot more active, right? That it's actually imparting all of this, like, lawfulness onto a lawless mess, rather than starting with, well, reality out there is lawful, and we're able to perceive that. It's that reality out there is, in fact, unknowable, ineffable, completely detached from us, and we are imparting every single law that we observe onto reality. Is that not like a correct assessment here?
So, just for a very brief historical diatribe, I'm pretty sure it's Jacobi. I think it was Jacobi. Of one of his many critiques, which, for those of you who don't know, by the way, it's very funny. Jacobi is the person that you used to. It's not as bad as it used to be, but if you typed Immanuel Kant in on like Google Images or whatever, the first like young strapping blonde lad who's kind of like turned to the side a little bit, that was actually Jacobi. And Jacobi was like just a super critic of Kant. He was one of Kant's biggest critics, especially after the immediate publication of the First Critique. All of this to say, just a little factoid there. There's this idea. So Kant, he's got this whole argument that he runs about, like, space and time has to the pure form of space and time has to belong to our sensible intuition in order for us to cognize empirical objects. Space specifically for empirical objects, time for all objects. But there's this argument that goes something like, well, Kant, like, what the hell, dude? You just haven't considered the possibility where, like, space and time just is of the objects and we're just picking up on it. And there's this third position that doesn't get talked about so much, but I think is really interesting, in that we have, it could just be the case that we have this form of perception of space and time that is like a genuine form of perception, but also objects just are in space and time, right? And people want to bring these up as like critiques of Kant's claim that we must conceive of space and time ideally. But I think what's really interesting is that when you think about why he's saying that, he's asking us, it's not a metaphysical treatise when he's saying that. He's not saying, this is the part that I think frustrates a lot of people. I can't say anything about what the world is apart from the way that it appears to me. This is like a fundamental epistemological problem, is that I can't do it. I can't license myself to think about how the world might be apart from my faculty of perception. Just like you were saying, the consciousness is consciousness of something. I can't think about what it is for there to be non-consciousness of something. Like, that's not what... It's a totally alien idea to me. But if it turned out, let's say God is real and God has this like third point of view, he has like the intellectual intuition, and he can just like seeing for us, how seeing works for us is how thinking works for God, is like the easiest way of thinking about that, where he can just manifest objects by the thought of them. And it's like, maybe God, with this intellectual intuition, looks above us and he's like, look at all these silly little philosophers out there who are thinking, these little Kantians who think that like space and time is ideal. Lo and behold, if they could only get out of their heads, they would see that it's the exact same in the metaphysically real world. That doesn't change anything for Kant. It changed nothing for the kind of claim that Kant is making, because Kant isn't giving a fundamental metaphysical hypothesis. He's doing epistemology. He's talking about what something is for it to be an object for us. And so this is why I keep coming back to where the metaphysical points start to come in is in delineating the scope of possible knowledge. And so if we just can't know something, if we can't know, then there's no sense in doing like a kind of metaphysical inquiry on it. This is what Kant says about the possibility for theoretical knowledge of God, for example, right? It's a dead-end project for humanity. We will never, even if God was real in some sense that I will never be able to comprehend whatever the hell real means in that world, we will never be able to give a theoretical proof for the existence of God. And so that these limits are what this Kant is trying to draw these limits, not to constrain, not to put us in a little box and say like, oh, this is as far as we can go, but to show us the scope of what is. So it's like two ways of looking at it. It's like, oh, well, Kant is telling us that we can't have an infinite cognition. First off, everybody accepts that we can't have an infinite cognition. Even Berkeley thought that we couldn't have an infinite cognition. God was the only thing with an infinite cognition, not us. So no one thinks we can have an infinite cognition. And so drawing the box itself isn't the problem. It's what the box is supposed to tell us about what we can possibly know. And sorry, this was like, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on there. So if I need to go back to any part of that, my apologies. I didn't mean to go so long-winded.
Yeah, no worries. So I think what like the fundamental distinction is, because indeed, yeah, Rand would definitely say, A is A. Of course, Ayn Rand discovered that fact. So yeah, definitely, there would be no infinite consciousness. I think everybody could agree that, well, unless, I mean, maybe there would be some crazy person out there who thinks that, obviously there's Heraclitus who thinks contradictions are true, but that's definitely, yeah, we can agree that there is no infinite consciousness. So consciousness is what it is. It has particular means of perceiving. Now, where I see Kant kind of going astray here is he's saying, because you've got particular means of perceiving, therefore what you're perceiving is in fact not reality as it really is. It's just reality as perceived by you, right? Whereas Ayn Rand would say, well, no, that's your means of perceiving reality, but it still is reality as it really is. The car really is red, right? That's not just referring to the car as perceived by you. That's referring to the car as it really is. It does have that property to it.
Yeah, but there's a certain extent to which like she has to be saying that again, because I think it's super important to keep coming back to the fact that like none of us want not Rand to be a naive realist, because all the things I've started to like about her disappear if she becomes a naive realist, right? And I don't want to run through the whole entire scope of the problem again, right? But like if when I say that the car is really red, I mean the car is really red apart from the form of perception that I have, then why do I need to make reference to the form of perception that I have in order to not elucidate, but in order to explain that the car is actually red in an objective sense? I should just be able to point and just be able to like, what the fuck do you mean? And they go, oh, well, your form of perception. And I go, no, the car right there, that one. Don't think about any perception stuff. If we have the capacity to make those sorts of claims, and that the world is what has the justificatory force, and we're just causally uptaking it, then we don't need this theory of sensation, percept, so on, that gets us to justified empirical knowledge.
So I don't think you need to have this what is it really in itself part, apart from our perception. Because perception is perception of the thing as it really is, right? There isn't a perception of a thing as it really isn't, because that's just not a perception. The Kantian viewpoint must have it that, well, the form in which you perceive the thing, that in fact is creating the thing in a sense. It didn't have existence before, at least not inherently. And now it does have existence to it. So in a sense, you have the perception is a thing maker there. Like that's the problem, because then, well, that is divorcing you from reality as it really is.
Let me. I know I keep circling this, but this is where I think the real tension is, and if I think if it's the gap between it's not I don't want to say gap yet. I don't want to presume, but it's this move of sensation automatic integration to percept. On your view, is sensation of an object,
Yes.
of an entity?
Yes.
Then what do we need? What do we need the automatic integration of the percept for?
Well, that's to bring together the sensations. That's if it serves a biological purpose, I think, so that you can actually perceive the entity. You can perceive that there's a lion there, rather than there's a yellowish. There's something yellowish. There's something furry. Ow, there's pain. It seems to me that having an actual percept there makes it a lot easier to go, oh, lion, time to get the fuck out of here.
But the problem is that this is Russell's theory of acquaintance. This is Russell's sense datum theory of acquaintance, what you're describing here, where we get this sense data uptake that must be of an object, but what we get is sense data as sense data, and we know that that sense data is of an object, but it's sense data. And then what we do, the sense data carries with it truth and justification automatically. It's an unfalsifiable state. The sense data just is what it is. It's like a decree almost on Russell's view. And then all we have to do, we get justification for free from sensing on Russell's view, and then we just build up from there, right? And Rand wants to distinguish herself from the sense data theorist. She does not want epistemology to be a process of this window theory. The idea that the only role of the percept is just to bundle these things together. Well, she's already got an entire theory of bundling things together in measurement omission or distinguishing things, and there's nuance there. I don't want to make it sound like it's like this super basic theory. Like just getting to the concept of units is pretty interesting, but if we already have the ability to take the matter of sensation of the matter of the empirical world, and from that abstract out into all of the impossible empirical knowledge that we could ever come up with on Rand's view, then what exactly is it? Can't just be a neurological function that the percept is doing, unless it just so happens to be the case that, like, hey, we don't need this percept thing at all in order for us to get the justificatory structure of an object as an object for us. We only need the sensation, and it just so happens that we evolved this way. And just to be very clear again, the problem with that theory is that we become sense data theorists as soon as we say that.
Well, so again, I think you can have the percept being serving this neurological biological function, and it's not that we just so happened, randomly to evolve that way. Of course, evolution is a lawful process. Clearly, it is very beneficial for animals to be able to perceive things. That's why most of all animals do indeed perceive things. They don't just have pure sensation. Allegedly, some like small, like couple cells worth of animals do indeed have just sensation. Not sure what exactly they do to show that, but it definitely does serve this very useful biological role for us to have percepts. Now, as epistemologists, I suppose you'd call it, that is the given. Like that's just where we've got to start. You can investigate why is that the case. That's really outside the realm of epistemology there.
Are you familiar with any work? I only want to dip into this briefly just to caveat it now, but just like to see if we share in this, but are you familiar with like any of the Salarzian or McDowell arguments against the given? Very famously, the myth of the given, as Sellers calls it.
Not particularly, no.
Well, in short, I just want to talk about one part of it because I think it's kind of interesting. And that Sellers runs like this very convoluted. It's in Empiricism and the Philosophy of the Mind is the name of the paper, published in the 50s, I guess. I hope I'm not wrong on the decade. I'm pretty sure it was like 54 or something like that. But it like blew the doors off of epistemology. Everybody was like, "Whoa, this is the best thing since sliced bread." Um, and I disagree with a lot of it, to be very clear before I go into any of this. But I think Sellers makes a pretty interesting, and McDowell even more so later in Mind and World, makes this very interesting argument about discrimination, right? What does it mean to be able to select an object against a background that is just like full of possible arrangements of objects, right? And what makes us justified in selecting some collection of sensations as objects or, over others? And the way that the sense data theorist talks about it is going to be a kind of causal interaction story. They're going to be like, well, one form of a sense data theorist is going to be like, I actually don't get any sort of discriminated entities. I just get sensation, and then I have to do the work of discriminating them, and that's like a whole epistemological project. But some want to be a little more sophisticated, and they say that, well, actually, no, what I get in sense data are pre-discriminated objects, right? These are just like things that are causally apparent to me. And the Sellers and McDowell asked this question of like, how can it be possible that sensation, which on the second view, or on both views, sorry, sensation, which is the undiscriminated morass, like so far everyone at the table agrees, as far as my understanding of them, Rand, Kant, Sellers, McDowell, all of these people, even Russell, agree that pure sensation is this like undifferentiated manifold. It just is like, bam, sensation. It's all just there. It is sensation. And then we get to go and do this process of carving it out. And Sellers is like, okay, but if we just attribute the give, if what we want to do the work is the given, what's given to me isn't a Dr. Pepper. I'm not given a Dr. Pepper. I'm given the whole manifold of sensation, and then I have to do the work of carving it out. And I have to be able to say why I'm justified in carving out the Dr. Pepper can. And this is not Sellers' most famous argument, but I think it's the most interesting for the purposes here. And so what I think part of what Rand is trying to do, perhaps inspired by some of the critics of sense data theorists of her time, such as people, again, like Beatrice Edgell, who she wants to sidestep that question, and I think rightfully so, because it's a really fucking hard question to answer, by saying like, that's what the automatic integration is supposed to be doing. It renders this massive sensation into discernible entities for us. But as soon as you've done that, what people like Kant, Sellers, actually most of epistemology today, which you can take that as a pro for Rand or an anti, but just to throw it out there, is they're going to say that's where all of the work is. You've just condensed all of epistemology. How is it that I can get to the point where I have this justified access, or I have an access to an entity that itself carries justification by my awareness of it, that is a Dr. Pepper can? And that is the biggest gap right now in objectivist epistemology, is that they have to elucidate why it is the case that sensation can be turned into entities, and the entities are what carry the justification, where the sensation alone doesn't, because it can't. And that's I think the gap that the purely causal story doesn't get us to. It doesn't get us justification. It just gets us, again, like we can, sorry, just to say one more thing, we can maybe, I'll just go ahead and grant, evolution is pretty successful at, getting us to propagate our genes, right? And maybe evolution trend lines towards truth. But that's not what we want to be saying whenever we say that, whenever we want to say that there are, my awareness of the Dr. Pepper can is objective. There's a real Dr. Pepper can here as a Dr. Pepper can. The empirical object of a Dr. Pepper can is a real one. I don't want to have to make this gesture to like, well, evolution, it's like, pretty good at getting us to propagate our genes, and that's kind of useful. And so, because that's not a theory of justification.
Well, so I just want to be clear here on what you're getting at. Is the idea that oops
Sorry, lost my headphones.
oops daisies.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
A little too enthusiastic.
So I want to be clear here. Is the problem, because it strikes me that, well, it is given to me that I see that Dr. Pepper can, and I have never experienced any situation where I've been able to decide, hey, I'm going to not see that as a Dr. Pepper can anymore. I'm going to see it as an elephant instead. I've never experienced something like that. I don't know anybody who's able to do that to their own ability to perceive. Is the problem like sort of well, why will it keep being a Dr. Pepper can? What stops it from, what stops you from perceiving it as something completely different? Like, is that what you're getting at?
Not even so much that. Like, you could say that, like, modally speaking, this is just like a necessary thing. It will never fail. Like, this is kind of what I was getting at with like the Kant stuff earlier. Like, why he doesn't necessarily need the noumenal to make like the categories always work or something like that. We can just say it's like a necessary feature of them, that there are these norms that they follow, and it just always works in accordance with the norms. But like the question, or that works epistemologically because we're making reference to norms whenever we do that. We get the rules of cognition are what grant justificatory force to representations under the Kantian system. Like, sensation alone has no justificatory force. I was going to do another historical digression, but I'll save it just to stay on this trend. But sensation alone doesn't have any justificatory force. So the given, as given in Kant's view, isn't epistemically salient. It can't do any cognitive work for us on its own. And so we need to apply these rules effectively for how to take that given and cut it up into things that are cognizable as objects for us. And so, but he thinks that's a totally necessary, will never fail sort of system. Like the rules will always just apply themselves as rules. And so it's not the case that like, I need to know how it's the case that this doesn't suddenly turn into like an all red, all blue, all at the same time Dr. Pepper can or something like that. The question is, how is it a Dr. Pepper can for me at all? How is it possible that there is a Dr. Pepper can here? And we can agree there is a Dr. Pepper can here. And we can agree that this Dr. Pepper can comes from must originate in sensibility because I'm a finite rational being. We can agree on those things, but there's like a gulf between I must sense and there is a Dr. Pepper can that is a Dr. Pepper can for me. And that gap in there is where epistemology happens. Because once you have the object, you have the ground of justification. And once you have the ground of justification, you can build effectively, I think there are better or worse ones, but you can build pretty much any epistemological system you want from that ground.
So I think there are two questions at play here. One is the epistemic and one is decidedly not epistemic. So why is there actually a Dr. Pepper can there? Well, presumably because it was made in some factory and you went out and purchased it from a shop. That's presumably why there is a Dr. Pepper can there. Now, why are you able to perceive the fact that there's a Dr. Pepper can there? Well, I think there's an epistemic aspect to it, but it terminates in perception. It is the case that you are able to perceive that thing. I think that's not part of epistemology, is what is the specific mechanism by which the eye works, by which your sensation of touch works. That's not part of epistemology. That would be part of perception science for eye doctors and for skin doctors or neuroscientists or what have you. But now the epistemology part can go, okay, well, how were we able to identify that as a Dr. Pepper can as against a Pepsi can? Well, then you could go into like the theory of concepts and so on and so forth. But so there is a lot to say about that epistemologically, but I don't think there's anything to say about it on the level of, well, why is your perception valid. Well, that's what a perception is. Consciousness is consciousness of reality. Perception is perception of reality. Um, yeah, so like I'm not really seeing the problem with taking that as the given, but that is given to me. I don't have the opportunity to not to see that as a Pepsi can. I've never been able to do that. I don't know anybody who has been able to do that. Like it seems completely outside of choice for me.
Yeah, this is not like an attempt at a gotcha. I want to make sure I didn't make a mistake. Did I ask why is there a Dr. Pepper can, or how is there a Dr. Pepper can for me? Because the question I was supposed to ask was how is there a Dr. Pepper can for me, which I think is substantively different from why. Because I think you're right that if I want to ask why is there a Dr. Pepper can at all, then I can just say like, oh, cognition has a form. That form, and we could run the whole Randian construction if you wanted to, and I think like most of that can be translated into ways that I'd be pretty happy with. And so that gets us like the fundamental why. But there's a deeper question in that solving that. So we can agree that the experience of the Dr. Pepper can has this like apodictic quality to it. The perception is, as Peikoff likes, I don't like the use of axiom as Peikoff uses it, because axiom presupposes that there is no further question to ask about it. But I will 100% agree that there's this apodictic quality to the fact that there is a Dr. Pepper can for me, and that the answer to that apodictic question, why is it apodictic at all, is just that there is a form of perception. But then we ask that we can ask why does it have this quality to it, and that is the whole game of epistemology. Epistemology is not, we are justified in believing there are Dr. Pepper cans. That's the project of epistemology, is explaining how it is the case that we are. And I guess you could, if you wanted to, you could like deny all knowledge. Not saying that you are, but just like as a philosophical position, you could reject the framing of the question. But again, nobody at the table, nobody seriously engaged in epistemology wants to do that. And so, and the asking of the further question, how, isn't illicit, because if the only criterion was that I just need the theory to be able to tell me why there are Dr. Pepper cans, well, there's lots of theories that tell me why Dr. Pepper cans are objects for me, that they are justified in the basis of rational justification henceforth. Lots of theories do that, but it's the how is how we discern which theories are the best ones at explaining that, and why there are a bunch of false theories that claim to be doing the true thing. And I think this is what the tension between Kant and Rand really is the question of, is why enough? Is the question of why enough to answer epistemology, and then we can just do empirical concepts from there. Why is there a justified object versus the question of how? And can we learn anything from the how that is of philosophical interest to us? And Kant's claim is that how is salient because it's going to be what gives us the scope of all of our knowledge of objects. All of our knowledge is going to be constrained to the scope of the same mechanism that makes it such that there is a Dr. Pepper can for me at all.
So because it seems to me like the problem you're pointing at with this question of how is the problem that Hume arrived at. It's the problem of, well, how do you get a necessary synthesis? I suppose, just like explicitly, is that the problem you're pointing at, and why there is more work to be done in epistemology when it comes to the how are you perceiving that? Why you have to dig down further than perception? Or is there some other problem for what the issue would be if you just take perception as the given?
Sorry, could you just one more time run that by me again? I just want to make sure I understood the question.
Sure. So I want to know, like, what is the, like, explicitly, what is the problem by just taking perception as the given and you don't dig further down below perception? Like, is the problem with that the problem that Hume faced, where you can't get a necessary synthesis? And so that's why more work needs to be done there.
The question of you can't get a necessary synthesis is going to come out of your how explanation, right? Hume, for what it's worth, in his own weird way in the Inquiries, thinks that like we do have knowledge of Dr. Pepper cans. We just have no theoretical account of the necessity of that. And so we can't claim to know the necessity of that. So we're in this like epistemic black box where the given of reality, so to speak, or at least let's say the given of experience, is that there is a Dr. Pepper can in front of me, and Hume is like, reason fails us. We can't explain why that is. We're not even really licensed to say it, but we think it nonetheless. This is like also Hume's line with causation, where like, he's like, how the fuck do we make sense of causation? And he goes through all of his possible examples, and he's like, well, we can't make any sense of it. And then he walks over to the billiard game and then hits the ball into the other balls, and they all scatter, right? And it's not the why question that is really the problem for Hume, and that gets like exposed pragmatically as soon as he walks over to the billiard table and doesn't like just wait for the balls to go crashing in all sorts of directions. Like he's committed to experience being causally structured, whether he likes it or not, whether he can theoretically justify it or not. And so Hume's problem comes in at the question of how. That's where Hume's problem comes in. And he doesn't see any route to the how because he doesn't lend himself to some of the tools that people like Kant will use later on. Namely, like for Kant, it's going to be synthetic a priori propositions are going to be, or synthetic a priori truths, are going to be what get us, are going to be what explains the how in such a way that we can have theoretical knowledge of these things with access to our experience, or from access to our experience. And so, yeah, I think the why question isn't the interesting one, because again, most people in the room already agree. There's very few people, like the super hard solipsists maybe. I can't remember the guy. I can't remember the Greek philosopher who was like, there is no knowledge at all. They
Cratylus?
would say that. What's that?
Was it Cratylus? Yeah, I think he's the guy who stopped talking.
Yeah. Yes. He would say the why question is that's where he wants to fight, is the why at all question. I think it's the how question is the one that at least from my conception. Maybe this will be convincing and maybe not, all of this talk so far. The how question is what discerns epistemological theories to begin with. The question between correspondence and consensus and coherentists and all of these things, and foundationalists, anti-foundationalists, internalists, externalists, all these epistemological theories, none of them are fighting about the why. All of them want to say there are Dr. Pepper cans. Every single one of them wants to say there are real Dr. Pepper cans. And it's not, the why isn't really what they're getting at. It's the how. How is it possible that we can have objective knowledge of Dr. Pepper cans? And these are where all the theories distinguish themselves. And that's what worries me so much, is that I see the how. I think Rand fairly gives the reply that the why question is a silly question to ask. And people who are deeply confused on epistemology do ask the why question in a way that can be handled very quickly. It's the how question is the one that I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for the how question from sensation to awareness of objects as entities. I'm waiting for that bridge, because that's where all the work is getting done.
So I think the big problem here, and I can kind of elaborate on why you don't hear the how question from objectivists, why we do indeed stop at what perception is the given. It's because we see this as a complete pseudo problem. We do not think that Kant ever had to answer, well, yeah, you of course have to answer Hume if you're going to do philosophy at that time, but we think that Hume was bringing up a non-issue, complete non-issue, namely the problem of necessity. We don't think it's a problem at all. And this is not purely an objectivist viewpoint. Other Aristotelians have come to accept this. So what is meant by calling a fact necessary is that the opposite involves a contradiction. And the problem is supposed to be, well, how do you get... we can all figure out how that would happen with married bachelors and whatnot, This is Kant's supposed like analytic synthetic dichotomy. But that's just, talking about words, right? That's not actually saying anything about reality. So then what by necessity means is that it obtains by identity, right? That's just the positive form of the opposite involves contradiction. So this is already resolved by our theory of causality. Because every single thing that happens, if we're talking in metaphysics, happens by necessity. There were no alternatives possible. It wasn't possible for the sky to be green. It wasn't possible for the Earth to be in a different solar system. None of these things were possible, metaphysically speaking. So this rests on two basic points. I think it's two. That all action is action of entities, and that what an entity does depends upon what it is. So, for instance, all action is action of entities. You can't just say, "Oh, well, there's a lot of eating going on next door." So, oh, well, what's doing the eating? No. There's nothing in particular doing the eating. There's just a lot of eating going on. It's like, okay, well, that's fantastical. That's nonsense. Can't have that unless you're, I suppose, Heraclitus or something. So we would say that all action is action of entities, and then what an entity does depends on what it is. A cigarette can't eat cake. It's not possible for a cigarette to do that. That's not within its nature. Saying that something is doing an action, well, that presupposes certain things about it, namely that it's got a digestive system that has a certain mass. So like that's why if you release a ball, there aren't multiple different things that could happen if you release that ball. It's not that it could go up or down, because that would imply contradictory things about the ball. That it has a certain mass, it has a certain density, I should say, and it has a completely different density. One density would make it rise, one density would make it fall. Or that the ball could turn into Hegel or Bugs Bunny when you release it. Like it's not the case that there are all these incompatible things, because incompatible possible actions, well, that means that would have to derive from incompatible, read contradictory, aspects of the thing's nature, which means that it is not what it is, which means that A is no longer A. And that's why the objectivists are so... We love to hammer in on A is A. I know it gets made fun of sometimes, but this is kind of one application of that. Is that, well, if you know that A is A, you can get this whole theory of causality out of that, which completely completely obviates the problem of necessity. There is no problem of necessity here. That which is necessarily is. So the whole framework that Kant is building for us, his answers the question of how, well, it's actually none of that is necessary at all. You didn't need to answer that. You could have just completely destroyed the entire problem. If you were Aristotle, I suppose you would have done that. And then you no longer have to build up all this stuff trying to answer the how. And that's why objectivists are terminating at the point of perception. That's why we're not looking at, as far as epistemology is concerned, how are you perceiving that thing? It's just that is the given, and the supposed problem that comes from taking that as the given actually doesn't exist. There is no problem there.
I can't decide whether... I'll just address it head on, and then maybe we can go to... I'm seeing a parallel between like free will stuff that I think might be interesting to get into between this how and why question. But just to like address the stuff that you were getting at head on. So, of course, if the fundamental epistemological unit really is... if the fundamental epistemological unit is of unified objects, entities, that we are justified in taking to be the way that they are, then you do get most of what you're talking about from that. And the how question is just, again, it's not to try to reject the fact. So actually, sorry, I want to back up a little bit, because I think there's a better way of doing this necessity question. And it's not... What I think you're right that the objectivists license themselves the ability to forego considerations of necessity that bothered the moderns: Kant, Locke, Hume, even Descartes. All of these people, Spinoza, Leibniz, all of them were concerned with this idea of necessity. And the objectivists licenses themselves to foregoing this idea of necessity as apart from like the contingent or this analytic synthetic distinction by taking by just for I don't want to say this in a way that sounds like condescending or something, but just by like starting from, okay, we've accepted the answer to the why question, perception as a form, Dr. Pepper. Once you have that, of course, everything is going to have an empirical answer to it. Of course, it's all ultimately empirical because you're starting with the empirical thing. There isn't going to be any like a priori necessity or analytic necessity that you get from just starting with the Dr. Pepper as an empirical object. And that right there, that's Hume's point. And so when he says when you say, Hume, you're trying to like manufacture this thing that you don't need under Hume's framework, well, yeah, that's kind of like Hume's conclusion. Is that it isn't so much that Hume says in the inquiry, Hume doesn't really say, or actually it's in the treatise, I think. I think it's the second treatise on human nature, human understanding. Either way. Hume's point about necessity isn't really so much that like, we're like cast to the seas because we can't have necessity. If only we could have necessity. It's more like, well, this necessity thing just doesn't seem to have anything behind it at all. And like, that's what you would need to be making the kinds of claims that dogmatic rationalists are going to be making, is you need this kind of necessity, and you don't get the necessity when you start at the level of Dr. Pepper cans. And Kant doesn't think you get necessity when you start at the level of Dr. Pepper cans either. You're going to look for it, you're going to hunt for it, you're going to try to find it in the world, and you're going to come to the same determination as Hume, that something is wrong with this conception of necessity. And that's where, again, coming back to this distinction between the how and the why question, it's the how there is an entity for us at all, from sensation to whatever the hell happens to entity. That process right there is where the necessity comes into the consideration. So if you start from granting the why question and you begin your epistemological inquiry from Dr. Pepper cans, and then you just build empirical concepts from there, you don't need necessity. You don't need some sophisticated account of necessity in order to do any of that, because through the justification of the object as an object for me, through the processing of sensation into an object that is an object for me, the necessity conditions are built into the how question, that space in between the two gaps. And so, yeah, in a sense, like Kant and Rand are talking past each other. When Kant says, you need to find the necessity, he's not really talking to Rand whenever he says that. I mean, he would probably say what I'm saying, or something to the effect of, you don't have a complete epistemology yet. You have the why question, but you haven't answered the how question. He may say something like that. But if we just grant that framing, he would be like, yeah, cool. Like you've already got all the necessity stuff. You don't need some further account of it baked in. There's nothing to distinguish the synthetic from the analytic, or you could still do a priori and a posteriori in this framing, because it's all going to be fundamentally empirical. And then we have just a distinction between words, and then all this stuff that actually happens with objects as we perceive them. It's that gap is, I think, where the two come apart in the biggest way. And so maybe the ultimate question of whether you think Kant has anything to say at all epistemologically is whether or not you think that we ought to be able to give an account of that justification and not presume the justification. Whether we rightly, from an apodictic certainty, know that there must be some justification or not. Whether or not you think the how question is one worth asking and one that contributes to our overall epistemological theory is maybe where the biggest distinction between the two actually lies.
Just real quick, are you holding a bullet in your left hand?
Oh, yeah, sorry. It was just sitting on my table, and so I just kind of like unconsciously picked it up. Yeah. Yeah, sorry
It's
about
it's
that.
a threat.
I'm I'm from Texas, okay? These things are everywhere. I like step on them when I'm like walking around my apartment. So,
you
um
know. So uh, anyway, like I just want to be like abundantly clear. The is the problem with not answering the how question. I just want to clarify. Is it indeed that, well, there's this problem of necessity? Because if that is the problem with not answering the how question, well, if the Aristotelians already have a separate answer on the metaphysics for why there is no problem of necessity to begin with, well, why the hell would we have an answer to it on the epistemic level if we don't even think it's a problem, right? We've already dealt with that in the metaphysics. Now, when we're up in epistemology, we're not going to suddenly tack on a whole extra thing in epistemology, which to answer a non-existent problem.
actually great question, and something I probably should have brought up a lot earlier is that believe it or not, Kant's aim in the first critique isn't really Dr. Peppercans at all. The in the preface he makes it pretty clear that like what he's setting out to do is he's looking out at metaphysics at his time, like the field of metaphysics, and he's like, man, this all sucks. Like, what the hell is going on here? Like, everybody sucks at metaphysics right now. Why is this happening? And the whole book revolves around actually like a couple of central metaphysical claims that like have always come up. And this is like free will, the existence of God, the immorality of the soul, or the immortality or eternal soul. And he's like these three questions are things that people keep coming back to, and they continuously fight over them. And there's never been any meaningful progress on these things. And like he gives his thesis, antithesis structure about why all of this is possible, blah 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 blah. The thing that we get isn't the important part of Kant is not that we get certain knowledge of Dr. Peppercans. That's a cool thing, but we all already knew that. That's not why you ought to read Kant. It's the further thesis that the same thing that makes it the case that we can have Dr. Peppercans at all for us as objects is what gives us the guide for metaphysical inquiry at all. And just to bring up something, I referenced it earlier, but just because I loved it so much when it came up, I want to say it again. In the ITOE, in the workshops, when people said, metaphysically speaking, Rand didn't waste any time. Every time she's like, what do you mean metaphysically speaking? What is going on when you say metaphysically speaking? And I think that is like, to me, that's like, I love that sort of line, that line of questioning, because I think it like cuts right through the knife, or it cuts the knife right through the butter. I'm just completely butchering this. Cuts like a hot knife through butter on what is actually going on when someone asks, when someone says metaphysically speaking, as opposed to epistemologically speaking. They want to distinguish these two things entirely. And I think, again, I hope it's not a misreading of Rand, because it was one of my favorite things about her. Whenever she would be like, whoa, like, hey, let's pump the brakes real quick. You need to tell me what you mean, because if you want to say divorced from epistemology, I don't have any idea what you're getting at. And like, arguably the entire point, the critique of pure reason, the entire thing that he's critiquing is he's setting up the scope of metaphysics for us. This whole book is just a primer so that we can go out and do actual metaphysics afterwards. That's the quote unquote critical project, is to set the foundation for future philosophy. And I think when you read it that way, you start to see that like the concerns about Dr. Peppercans, of course Kant is going to be asking something deeper than concerns about Dr. Peppercans, because he's trying to see if there's any way through this sort of, I don't want to say backwards, that's the wrong phrasing, but through this kind of like antagonistic process of reason, where he's like holding reason's feet to the fire. And he's like, hey, these dogmatic rationalists say that like you can prove theoretically the existence of God through these like, transcendental proofs or something, which ironically, Kant was the first to write one before later rejecting it. And he's like, dogmatic rationalists think we can do that. Can you actually do that? How can you do that? And it's Yeah, sorry, I'm looping at this point, so I'll just stop there.
I suppose I just want like the upshot of that, because I maybe I'm just not picking up on what you're trying to say here. Um, but if Rand and other Aristotelians already have licked the problem of necessity, and the problem of necessity is the motivating factor behind all of this epistemology that Kant comes up with, the answering of the how do you get the Dr. Pepper can as an object of perception. If that's already licked, then like, well, surely she doesn't need to answer the question of how, and she can just stop at perception. Like, what is the issue with doing that, if not the problem of necessity?
Yeah, I mean so like the answer is going to be like, does the Aristotelian metaphysics actually work? Or sorry, this is just Aristotle's metaphysics. I know I just made tried to not make the distinction between epistemology and metaphysics, but I think Aristotle actually does. I'm not an Aristotle scholar, for what it's worth, and so I don't want to be able to come up here and pretend like I'm going to be able to perfectly reconstruct his argument. But
I do want to clarify, it's not necessarily. I'm not certain, because obviously a lot has been lost from Aristotle, and what we have is very fragmented. It's not entirely clear, as far as I'm aware, if Aristotle himself endorsed this view of causality. He seemed to have a somewhat different viewpoint, but most modern Aristotelians do accept it, just to clarify.
Yeah, then that's a debate that could be had, as far as if the Aristotelians give this account, then maybe there's a debate between the Aristotelians with that account of necessity and Kant, and that's a debate. We could go back and forth on why one works, why one doesn't work, and we can exchange that. But I think that is a different, not to be Mr. Debate guy who's like, the debate's about Kant and Rand, but like I know Rand respects the hell out of Aristotle, and she bases a lot of her work on Aristotle. And for what it's worth, Kant rips the categories right out of Aristotle. Basically, he goes, yoink! Thank you, Aristotle, for that. These are the categories. And but I don't recall her giving like the substantive metaphysical commitments for why necessity isn't a problem. She explains why necessity isn't a problem, and Peikoff even more so in his later works, through the epistemological, through the perceptual. And that is, from my understanding, again, not as an Aristotle scholar, is a substantively different kind of argumentation that's going on than Rand's. And it would be very interesting to see how those two come together. But I can only say so much on that specific debate.
So I'm utterly certain, I'll say, that Rand did endorse this view of causality, because it was published in works she actively endorsed while she was still alive. So maybe we could terminate the debate if you don't want to turn it into too much of a metaphysics debate. But as far as I'm aware, that just is where the answer lies for the objectivist. It is that, Peikoff says this explicitly in his History of Philosophy, that, well, these people are answering a complete pseudo problem. This is at least one problem that he points out with them. He has other problems, of course. But they are just, from the outset, there was no problem of necessity to begin with, because of what I've said, this whole view of causality, that every fact, that's the starting point. You don't have to show that the fact is necessary. Well, if it's a fact, then it is necessarily the case. The alternative would involve a contradiction, perhaps in some very subtle way, a lot more subtle than a married bachelor, certainly, but it still would involve a contradiction. It would be a ball rising when it's constituted such that its nature should cause it to fall. It would be something perhaps as subtle as that, but it still does involve some contradiction on some level, which is kind of just getting swept aside. And that's why the objectivists don't need to answer the problem of necessity on the epistemological level, because it's already dealt with down in the metaphysics.
Yeah, and I guess to immediately retreat from the metaphysical grounding of the question is to be like, well, how do you know that that's... Actually, I want to ask a clarifying question before we do this. because this is in the spirit of Rand. When we say that this is the metaphysical question, are we saying that this is like the ground truth of reality apart from any facts about our perception whatsoever? This is just how things are. That metaphysical, is that what we're doing, or are we doing some other kind of metaphysical?
So when I'm referring to this as like a metaphysical answer to it, I'm just saying that it's not part of the theory of knowledge. So I think there is like a proper distinction to be made between metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, so on and so forth. In that they're answering different questions. They are all the broadest possible questions you can make. But metaphysics is asking, well, what is the nature of reality as such? Like, what is reality? Then epistemology will be, well, how do you know that? Right? So, because this is talking in ontology, it's talking about how things are and how they therefore act. I think that's a part of metaphysics. I don't think Ayn Rand used the term ontology, but I think you probably class that as ontology.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I don't know how to answer this without looping again, and apologies for this, but just trying to do so earnestly. It seems to me the question is like, okay, well, how do we go about evaluating this proposal that we have? And it's like, well, we need to go into our there's a joke that like all philosophy begins in epistemology, and the rest just kind of like naturally follows out once you have a fixed theory of epistemology. And the reason it's a joke is that like philosophy has no consensus on what epistemology is, and this is why you get this like balloon of philosophical theories, right? So if we just solve epistemology, everything else follows suit. And I think that's why my first impulse is to ask, okay, that's an interesting theory. How do we know that? And then I turn to possible candidates for how we could come to know that. And like, if we go to Rand's theory, we're just going to, unfortunately, from where I'm standing, we're just going to run back into the same problem of like, okay, we want to talk about these ground truth commitments, or these ground truths about reality. These are like ontological facts about the way that the world is organized. And what we need is a story about, well, again, I'll just say what we need is a story about the sensation to object connection that retains the necessary information from the world as it is apart from our cognizing of objects in order to know that what we're talking about is actually just of the object as it is apart from our cognition of it. And yeah, I mean, again, this could be like we've gone down all sorts of roads on like how this could be addressed. Maybe it's a pseudo problem. Maybe it's not a pseudo problem, and actually the justification from a purely causal process is good enough. These are all possible answers to that. I, personally haven't found them super satisfying. Maybe someone out in the audience did, but I don't know how to like begin assessing the metaphysical proposal as a proposal distinct from my epistemological foundation without first asking how it is that I possibly know that. And if my method of knowing contains within it, if my method of knowing is taking that which is not an object in sensation and constructing objects of that, and then I want to make statements about objects as they are apart from how it is that I perceive it all, then I don't know how to begin to do that inquiry. It seems like I have to make a supposition about how that chain works in reverse that I just don't have any access to.
So the way that I know that this theory of causality is correct, to kind of reiterate, because it's been a while since I gave the validations, so I'll do it only briefly, is that I know both the law of identity is true, that is A is A, and I know that all action is action of entities. Because I know those two things, I can just make a real quick deduction, and the Randroids will probably have heard that from wherever they are and started screaming. But it is a deduction. That's what corollary means. So you can just very quickly construct an argument. Well, if all action is action of entities, and what an entity can do depends on what it is, that's the law of identity point, well, then in any specific set of circumstances, any entity could only ever act in the way that is caused by its nature. And that's how I validate this theory of causality. Right? That's how I know it to be true. Now, I didn't need to do anything about all I needed to validate were those 2 points. I suppose, which of those 2 points do you think is wrong, or do you think it's an invalid argument in some other way?
I think the problem is that you're lending yourself to percepts are things with identity, which again, totally agree. Percepts are things with identity. They're entities, they're objects. If we just take rand at her word, that has to be the case. And here's a question for you. Does sensation as sensation have identity as an object?
Sensation as sensation, does that have identity? I mean, I don't think sensation would be... it is what it is. Certainly, everything is what it is. But I don't think it would be an object. It's not like there's some, what was the term he used for it? Like res... something. The mind stuff, or what have you. I don't think there's, a greenness atom in your brain, and that's what the sensation is, if that's your question.
Yeah, I guess... I'm trying to think about what it would look like to work through this backwards, right? And so, we can both agree that the percept is an object. It's an object of the object. It's awareness of the object as an object. That's the best way of putting it. And so we work backwards from that story, and we have this automatic integration. And it's okay, things are happening there. We'll just go to the next part of that. We know things are happening, but we'll go to the next part, which is sensation. It's well, sensation isn't the object. But sensation is the matter of the object, right? And so to be talking about objects at all for us, again, unless I'm mischaracterizing Rand's view, but I really hope that I'm not, to be talking about the object as an object for possible knowledge is already to have done the integrative process from sensation, which is not an object. It is an object as sensation, but sensation as sensation is not a Dr. Pepper can, as far as I read her. And that transition there from front to back and then back to front, I guess, is to move then to go one step further and then to be able to talk about how the object is apart from that epistemological structure, is presuming that the integrative faculty or the automatic integration that's going on is just going to be this roundabout sort of way of getting a mirror to what's behind sensation. And I just don't see what licenses us to that determination.
So, I can continue, but I just need to go to the bathroom real quick. Do you want to continue this debate after I come back?
I think we're almost at 2 hours, right? Yeah.
I mean, we could wrap it up. Soon, so. we could wrap it up there.
Yeah.
So yeah,
we can wrap up. If you have anything closing things or anything, I've got a couple of minutes, so I'm not in a mega rush. So.
Well, I am, because I really need to take a piss.
Well, hear about this. You could go to the bathroom and then we can close up. How about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be okay. 1 moment.
Hello, chat. I hope you guys have been enjoying this. I've been having a lot of fun, for what it's worth. It's hard to find people to have rigorous epistemological conversations with, and I think this has been pretty good. Of course, some fundamental disagreements, but that's what we're here for. That's, I do it for the love of the game. So, let me see. Let me open up the chat, actually. Let's see. What do we got here? Ooh, some intense side conversations going on. Man, I haven't done this live streaming thing in so long. I used to be able to, just keep the air full, but... Okay, we do great stuff from Huge Hat Herald. Glad you liked it. Stolid Vision. Glad you liked it as well. Yeah, I thought this was pretty good. I just hope. I hope that if I achieve, I'll save it for the closing. I kind of want Zulu to be here for this. So, uh, but let's see. Seems more like a Kant lecture though. I tried to not make it that way. I'm sorry. I tried to like just bring in the concepts when I needed to rather than like info dump a whole bunch of Kant stuff. So my apologies if it ever turned into like a big Kant lecture. That wasn't my intention. So oh, fun fact, most Randian philosophers don't even accept sensationalism in perception anymore. That is very interesting. If you are aware of anybody who comes to mind, like some who has some good literature on that, I would totally be interested in reading it because, like a big part of what I've been doing up here is like kind of like poking that, uh, the problems I see from that. But if Randians are moving away from that conception of it, that's really interesting to me. Does kind of, I watched the open closed system debate. It does kind of make me wonder if you depart from Rand on that sensationalism point, uh, does that make you not a Randian anymore if it's a closed system? But I think personally, I think open system is like way better. But what is my name on Discord? It would actually probably be easier if you just like followed me on Twitter. I don't even remember what my handle is. Sorry, I don't use it super often anymore.
Yo.
Sorry, I was just chatting with the chat for a bit. So
No worries. And yeah, so I suppose I could get. I think it would make sense if you had like the final word, because I think I had the first word. So I suppose we could just each like wrap up the debate as we saw it and like our position. Like, yeah, I think there are many problems with the Kantian epistemology and other parts of his philosophy, of course. I mean, there's things we didn't even touch on, like obviously the objectivists don't believe there is such a thing as an analytic-synthetic dichotomy. We believe that every fact is both analytic and synthetic. There isn't like some gap there. But I think the real problem with Kant that I've gotten at here is, first of all, he's not answering a question that is a real problem, namely the problem of necessity. There was a pseudo problem the whole time. And then on top of that, his answer doesn't actually get us any further. Because there's all kinds of problems with his answer. Namely, it's, oh, well, you can retain certain things, and that's how you get like the image. If I look at your face, I get the image of the lips. But then, well, if I look over at the image of the eye, well, all of a sudden I've lost the image of the lips. So I need to form some sort of like meta image of the eye-lip system. And then if I look over the nose, then, well, I need a meta image of a meta image of all three of them. And so I think it kind of ends up in some sort of infinite regress there. And also, it all ends up terminating in this kind of gesturing at this unknowable thing. So even if the problem of necessity was a true problem, I don't think that Kant's answer actually does anything for us. And certainly, that's what we end up with in the history of philosophy, a good test to see if somebody's been a good, proper, constructive philosopher, is where does it end up as people keep going on? Well, we see what we ended up with after Kant. Kant took over, and we ended up with skeptics, we ended up with pragmatists, who are all just basically saying, yeah, no, you can't know anything about reality, so let's just, I suppose, deal with that in some sort of way. Now, if Kant was supposed to be an answer to the skepticism of Hume, it seems to me he's done a very bad job at it, if we've still got all this skepticism. So I think that's going to be my main problem with Kant as far as the epistemology is concerned.
yeah, I guess from my perspective, the big things that I hope that I accomplished to at least some extent is to separate what I think is the scope of the genuine criticisms of Kantian epistemology from the aesthetic disagreements of Kantian epistemology. I think terms like noumenal have been abused by a lot of philosophers. I think even a lot of historians of philosophy have abused them, particularly like early 20th century analytics who were not like very well versed in Kant, did a lot of damage to people's conception of what Kant was actually doing. And I think what we've seen in the turn of the late 20th century into the 21st century is this move towards whether you're what's called a two-aspect theorist or two-worlds theorist interpretation of Kant, of one that moves away from this view of Kant as this like person who's blocking us off from knowledge of things as they actually are, that are actually out there, but we just can't get to them. And rather is just a person who's just engaged in an epistemological project. And once you separate what epistemology has to say for the field of metaphysics from epistemology as metaphysics, I think that distinction starts to become a lot clearer. And broadly, I said it a billion times, so I don't want to beat the horn too much. One of the really fun things about me getting ready to do this debate was that I was like, oh, what the hell? I haven't read Rand in years. I've learned a lot since then. I probably gained something through going back and reading her and Peikoff. And I did. I came out of it with like a very meaningfully updated conception of what Rand commits herself to. But I'm not... That doesn't mean that I therefore am like, yeah, Rand's got the sauce. I think she has a much more sophisticated view than people give her credit for. And as much as the Randians will hate me saying this, I think there's a hell of a lot more in line with the Kantian spirit of doing philosophy in Rand when compared to like the dogmatists or the skeptics of other sorts than would be apparent from people just viewing the criticisms of each other from the outside. Whether or not that's an olive branch or not, or if it's like the thing that makes Kant the most evil is that he could have been so much better than he was, but chose not to, or something like that, is not for me to decide. But this has been a fruitful project, and I'm glad to have gotten to talk epistemology with somebody. I don't get to do it enough. So
yeah, absolutely. It was a blast having you on. Feel free to, if we have any more disagreements in future, I suppose we can hash them out. Yeah, thank you very much. I think people. What was? Did you figure out your Twitter account so people can find you?
Sorry. I can't. I can never. Yeah. So my @ is the Swolosopher. I made this account a long time ago. In fairness, okay. But yeah, the Swole with one L O Ossifer. So yeah, if you want to, some people were saying they were going to DM me some reading on some more like updated objectivist epistemology stuff that doesn't lean so hard on the sensibility to or sensation to percept chain. So that's probably why they were asking. But yeah,
Sure.
I can also just put it in the chat if that's easier. So
yeah, no, I'll stay on for another a couple minutes whilst I read the super chats anyway. So because that'll give you time to do that. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on. I'll see you later. Alrighty. Wait. Let's see, did I get anything on this end? Cool. All right. I was just checking to see if there were any donations on Twitch. By the way, you can give me free money on Twitch if you have Amazon Prime. So make sure to do that if you've got a Twitch Prime subscription. Might as well. It doesn't cost you anything. But yeah, let's go over the super chats. From Thunder Gaming 6342 for $5 US. Thank you very much. If matter cannot be created, how can wealth be created? So I mean, matter can be created if you get enough energy together. Obviously, I don't think you're being super serious with this question. Wealth creation is a different question. It's are you coming out and producing something? That is producing wealth, namely. And then a huge hat Harold for $10 US. Thank you very much. Pardon me. Zulu, what do you think of Binswanger's Gibbsonian theory of perception as opposed to Rand's? Namely, perception is a unitary phenomenon. It does not have sensations or anything else as components. Well, I haven't read much Binswanger, unfortunately, so I can't comment on that. I mean, ultimately, perception science is kind of, I don't think it's necessarily part of epistemology. And then Heterodox Agnostic 8070 for 20 Kruner, thank you very much. Moderated ecological psychology versus Randian debate with G. Wen. Well, I mean, if you can come up with like some particular point of contention that I actually disagree with, then sure. But I mean, I don't really do anything on perception science, so I'm not sure what specifically he would be disagreeing with there. But yeah, thank you everybody who came along, especially those who donated, and I'll see you later. G sure likes Binswanger's How We Know. Yeah, I've got that through in the other room. I haven't finished reading it yet, so it's interesting stuff. I don't have a problem with anything I've read so far. But yeah, I just don't know anything about perception science. But yeah, peace.